to fear or not to fear? That's a question most Lithuanians ask these days, awaiting for euro adoption in 2015. And as you can see, this is not a vague question, because if you look at Latvian and Estonian example, so 18 months before euro adoption, there were only around 7 to 14% of consumers that were fearful of increase in inflation over the upcoming year. But when the euro adoption approached, the numbers increased to 32 or 34%. So that was experience of Latvia and Estonia. In Lithuania, the number of consumers at present are 44%. So 44, close to one half of consumers are fearful of a significant price increase in the next 12 months. So the question is, how will it be when we will introduce the euro, and whether these fears are rational, so this is based on rational behavior, or just a poor superstition. So let's have a look how it was in Latvia and Estonia when they introduced the euro. And the share of consumers actually fearing inflation fell to just 12 to 15% 6 months after in introduction. So basically it came back to where it was just before introduction of euro. So we can expect very similar developments if history is of any use, also in Lithuania. So when the share of consumers that are fearful now of inflation should also fall significantly, because as history shows, the fact is that after introduction of eurozone, inflation doesn't increase as it was feared. So it's more, I would say, superstition or irrational fears rather than rational behavior that consumers have. And this graph is actually justifies this. If we look at Estonia, for example, inflation after introduction of euro didn't go up, basically stabilized and even fell a little bit, whereas in Latvia, inflation was very, very low before introduction of euro. Basically, it was negative even for some months, and after introduction of euro, yeah, it went a little bit up, but just a very marginal increase, and still mostly because of administrative price increases. So the governments usually tend to a little bit keep the prices a little bit before introduction of euro and then allow them to rise a little bit faster after euro is introduced. So if history again is of any use, in Lithuania it should be pretty similar, and even after introduction of euro, inflation would barely rise, so it would stay around 0% or hopefully a little bit positive. And looking at the general trend of inflation, we see that over the recent months, inflation in all Baltic states and as well in the whole eurozone is actually declining. So it's approaching the zero mark, and in Estonia it actually fell to minus 0.2%. So Estonia is experiencing deflation instead of inflation, and what we should be fearful of is not inflation but actually deflation. So it's a little bit paradoxical situation that Lithuanians are fearing inflation, whereas they should be in fact fearing deflation. And let's discuss a little bit why inflation is so dangerous in general, and why it's dangerous for Lithuania in particular. So many people say that, okay, why deflation is bad? Because falling prices, if you have falling prices and rising nominal wages, then the real purchasing power of households increase. Yes, so this is true. I totally agree with this, and this is actually one of the key factors behind the pretty robust domestic consumption growth. But deflation has many negatives. So first of all, if we look at the prices of goods produced in Lithuania, so by Lithuanian producers, by Lithuanian manufacturing, in this case this is excluding refined petroleum products. So we see that over the last year, the prices are declining. And even more worrying is that prices of goods that are exported, they decline even more than prices sold domestically. So this has a negative effect on our export performance because the goods that we produce become cheaper and cheaper. So other countries are valuing those goods less, and especially in the context of import ban of dairy products to Russia, we expect this tendency to continue. And this graph is again summarizing very well the difference between changes in export prices and import prices. And we see in Lithuania that export prices fell more than import prices. So basically, just the difference of prices made minus 3% negative effect on our net trade balance. So basically, just to keep the same external balance, Lithuanians need to export 3% more goods and services. So this is pretty dangerous situation. This is a negative of deflation, because if it would have been otherwise, if imports were becoming cheaper and exports were becoming more expensive, then it would be a positive sign. But in this case, this is clearly a negative for Lithuania. Other thing, which is even more important, I would say, is that if inflation is very low, and especially if we have like falling prices of goods produced, then the borrowing costs, the real borrowing costs, actually increases. So this gives pressure for companies to basically it becomes more and more difficult for them to service their debt obligations. And as you can, if you look at real borrowing costs, actually they exceed now 3% mark, and they are, if you look history from 2005, they are actually now close to the highest point, which was reached during the peak of the crisis in 2010. So this is actually can explain also why companies are so reluctant to borrow and invest in the future. It's just because of deflation. They expect prices of their products to decline, and therefore they are unwilling to take new loans and invest into the future. At the same time, if you look at other side of the coin, this is also true for savers. Since throughout most of the history, the real deposit rates were negative. So basically, if you keep your money in bank account, in real terms, you get actually less, because inflation is higher than what you get from your interest rates. But now we can see that it's very, very close to 0%. So if you look at history again, this is a pretty good time to save, and pretty bad time to borrow. So obviously it decreases borrowing activity, it decreases spending, and it increases savings. So it slows economic growth. So this is a pretty dangerous thing, because it can basically push Lithuania into deflationary spiral. And yes, of course, we need to leave some hope. And hope is European Central Bank, which said recently that it will use all available instruments needed to ensure price stability over the medium term. So euro is depreciating, euro is falling in value, and therefore many expect that inflation will eventually pick up in the eurozone, because one of the instruments that European Central Bank is considering is quantitative easing, or so-called money printing, and experience of other countries show that this should eventually increase inflation. But this definitely will be positive inflation and not a negative one, and this would pull out Lithuania of deflationary spiral. So thank you very much.